Okay, well, you're all very welcome. Thank you for your patience and my apologies. We definitely had some technical challenges there. It wasn't quite as big as the technical challenges around the lobotomy scandal, but it was getting there for a few minutes. It was pretty difficult. Everybody's just coming in, so I hope everybody's going to get comfortable. And we're very excited. Myself and Mia, and Carrie's coming in a second. It's not that she isn't here. It's just technically she's trying to get in. Um, we're very, very, very excited about this. Myself and Mia and Carrie have long wanted to do a kind of an analysis on the past medical scandals, and not just that they happened. And I think, Mia, you can give an awful lot of information about, how they happened and what happened. But there's more than that. There's also the fact that we can learn some lessons from history. We can figure out different things that worked and that didn't work, and the problems of moving out of a scandal is really quite significant, as they called it, the lobotomy delusion at some points. And what's noticeable with the lobotomy scandal, and I'm sure, Mia, you're going to tell us a lot more about it, but what's noticeable about it is that a lot of the doctors were quite critical. They were, the media loved it. Media loved the excitement of, there's nothing more exciting than people saying, I have a solution, a radical solution to human mental pain. And it sells papers. And so the media loved it, but the doctors kept their head in many ways and criticized it continuously. There was always the lunatic fringe that were very definitely charging ahead. But this hasn't happened with our own medical scandal. That's been the difference, the kind of the acquiescence, arguably, of the medical population. We're going to start in full in a couple of minutes, but at the moment, we're just letting everybody come in, and hopefully we'll have Mia or Carrie come in as well. Mia, could you perhaps, just to kick us off, could you perhaps just settle everybody down by kind of giving a bit of an analysis about the background to the lobotomy, what you first heard about when you first started writing about it, what you thought, you know what I mean? Just to give a bit of a background to it. And quite soon we'll get Carrie in. She'll tell us all about the very exciting news that Genspect now has CME accreditation. Oh, here she comes. Speak of the devil. As she's arriving in, she can tell us about the CME accreditation that we are. Oh, there you are, Carrie. I was just about to ask Mia. So will we hold your question, Mia, and you can tell us the background of the lobotomy. But first of all, Carrie, could you perhaps, because I was just talking about the CME and how it's...
Okay.
So maybe you'll
Yes,
tell us a
yes.
little bit about the CME.
Well, hello. There were technical gremlins. But yes, we are so excited, Stella, because we are able to offer continuing medical education and continuing education units for our webinars, including this one. And that allows physicians, nurses, other folks in the health professions to gain credit for watching our webinars, which is part of maintaining our licensure. So we're excited because we want to be able to offer that for all the great information and content that we're putting out there to help, solve all these problems. So really exciting. And Genspect's Substack is up and running. And in order to get the CME certificate, you have to join our Genspect Substack, and there's more information there. So that's it, and we'll have lots of great content.
Yay.
Thank you.
So
Yay.
Mia, it's very exciting. We're thrilled. And well done, specifically, Carrie, on that one. Mia, could you tell us just the background when you first came across the lobotomy scandal? I know you did a big write-up for the WPATH Files about it. So kind of give us the background, first of all, before we launch into exactly what happened and how it happened. It's an extraordinary story.
Yeah, so for the WPATH Files, in the report, I compared lobotomy to the genital surgeries in gender medicine. I think today we'll do a broader comparison of all of gender affirming care. But the comparison is obvious in that, I had to choose lobotomy because that's the last time we tried to treat mental illness, mental distress surgically. And so I simply had to go there. I had to draw the comparison. When I embarked upon the research, I had a very different idea of the lobotomy scandal, in that I thought that it was a terrible crime, and I imagined all of these lobotomists to be just absolute monsters going around jabbing ice picks into the insane. And as I was researching it, I got a much better understanding of the context in which lobotomy arose, which I'm sure we'll get to in depth. But that's why when I concluded my lobotomy case study, I basically I concluded that gender affirming care is a greater crime than lobotomies because of the context in which this scandal is occurring. So I don't know, do you want me to go further?
Well, I think you raise a very good point before we go further, which is I used to think it was monsters. And then I read about how I reminded myself about how awful life was for psychiatric patients in those days, and how we really were swinging from the trees at that stage. We'd moved on a little bit from leeches and bloodletting, but frankly, it was a really bad way. And to have psychiatric problems at the time was devastating. And I was reading about, the different kind of proponents of the lobotomy, and they'd all had kind of mental challenges themselves in their own way. And that was very interesting, because I thought, no wonder they were very, very excited at the idea of having a solution.
Right. Well, I mean, that's it. There were no good solutions. There were no good options for people who were genuinely mentally unwell. So if you were diagnosed with a mental illness back in the lobotomy era or prior to it, the outlook was really, really grim. There were no antipsychotic drugs. There were, you were going to be confined to an asylum. The conditions were absolutely deplorable. And for the most violent cases, for the most agitated cases, they would be restrained in straitjackets, or they could be tied to a wall. They could be kept in isolation. So the options were really limited and really quite awful. And then you bring in the very violent remedies that they came up with. They came up with some crazy remedies, like insulin coma therapy. They would give people a massive dose of insulin, put them in a coma, and then wake them up, and the convulsions were somehow thought to relieve their agitation. And I think it maybe did temporarily. I'm not really sure what the science was behind that, but they were more docile for a period of time after they woke up. Metrazole was another one. They used to give them this drug, metrazole, that the convulsions were so strong that they would, break bones. The convulsions were so violent. Obviously, electroshock therapy that we all know. So when lobotomy comes along, and the patients they're left in a docile state. They're left in various states of dependency, but they're calmer, they're less violent, they're less agitated, and crucially, they could mostly be taken home to be cared for by family members. And so you can really see why desperate people working in mental asylums, desperate families, desperate patients went for it, especially with the mainstream media totally overblowing the benefits and downplaying the harms and selling it as this miracle cure.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I see in the chat there, and the chat is now open, and all the live streaming platforms have been beautifully enacted despite our challenges. And I think, somebody makes a great point that a lot of the diagnosed as mentally ill weren't mentally ill. And then, however, some of them were very mentally ill, and they were put together. If you follow me, they were put together. So often there was a lot of misdiagnosis, and then there was some extremely extremely mentally ill people who were tied down, chained down. And then there was an very notable misogynistic streak. I was reading today, you know, in the first 20 lobotomies, now that's moving on to kind of Walter Friedman and his kind of regime. But in the first 20 lobotomies he carried out, 17 were women. So even though there was way more males who were mentally ill, so there was definitely a misogynistic aspect to this.
And yeah, and also you have to remember the time, like in the 20s and 30s, when testosterone was started to, you know, be synthesized, and estrogen and all that, as well as insulin. So there was really kind of the early stages of the pharmaceutical revolution, in the sense that they thought, oh my gosh, wow, this could really help, because obviously in the case of diabetes, that was very revolutionary. But the idea of putting someone in a coma, it was more to, what happened was they really were inducing a seizure, because when you get very hypoglycemic, you basically have a seizure. So someone is like post-ictal, which means their brain was so shocked from the seizure that it's like slow, it's recovering, and certainly they're slow to recover and respond. But some of these people, clearly with the repeated induction of seizures, had long-term sequelae. But they were trying to get at what you said, what you were talking about, Mia, is that it was very challenging to manage these patients and figure out how to control them and do it in a humane way. So I think that, you know, but the pharmaceutical revolution, the promise of these medicines really, I think, was very captivating, and led to kind of more like, well, what else is out there that we could do?
Yeah, just back to the them not being especially mentally ill. There's a really great parallel there, I think, with gender medicine, and that's, in the beginning, certainly, I think lobotomies were supposed to be a last resort. They were supposed to be for the most extreme cases, for the most violent cases, and for the cases that there was no hope. And it very quickly, because as doctors tend to do, they got swept up in the excitement of it, and the media's playing along and feeding the frenzy. And then it became widespread medical practice, and it was lobotomies for basically anything that ails you. And because it was being sold as the cure for, you know, mild anxiety, depression, whatever, obsessive compulsive disorder, people were reading those articles, and then they were, you know, becoming fixated on this lobotomy as being the cure for either their loved one or for themselves. But it's just like, I think, gender medicine, in that in the early days, I think the surgeries and the hormones were somewhat reserved for those with the long-term gender dysphoria that was persistent, and then over time, it just has morphed into, again, we got swept up in the excitement of it, and now it's puberty blockers on the first appointment, testosterone after an hour at Planned Parenthood, and, you know, surgeries for anyone who wants them. It's when there's no restrictions, when there's no external control over the excitement of doctors, I think we end up in very terrible places.
Yeah, it reminds me, I was reading about Igaz Moniz, am I pronouncing it right? So he kind of created the concept and he called it the leucotomy. Is that right? Leucotomy. And which was, you know, doctor's experiment, and he had a chance meeting really with Walter Friedman, and off it went. But what he had created was something that a surgeon needed to perform. And so at first, you know, Walter Friedman had to get a surgeon, which was James Watts, to kind of perform along with him. And then it feels very paralleled with the gender medicine, because Walter Friedman decided he needed to make this whole situation simpler. And so he created his transorbital lobotomy. And with that, suddenly it went from being a kind of clinical operation to being almost an office procedure, which very much reminds me of the determination of people around in the trans medical world. Make it easier, get more people, make it more accessible, rather than, no, don't make it easier. Make sure that it's good, because it looked like at first, Walter Friedman and James Watts were saying that there was great results from Moni's procedures, but there weren't great results. 15 years later, they're saying the results weren't good enough, so we expanded it rather than reduced it. It's like we're making the same mistakes again and again and again. And it's frightening to watch the kind of familiar kind of cycle.
Right. But I mean, back to the why gender medicine I think is worse is, if I'm not mistaken, I think Freeman came up with the transorbital lobotomy. It was around the same time as, that Bedlam article. It was in Life magazine. It was that investigative piece about the two mental asylums, and they released photographs, and there was a really, really devastating bit of investigative journalism revealing just how horrific conditions were in these mental asylums. And that came out in 1946. And it was around the same time, I think, that Freeman decided we need a solution to this. Like, people cannot live like this. And it was after the Second World War, you see, and a lot of people had come back in various states of really poor mental health and had flooded the asylums, and the asylums couldn't cope. And really, people were living in utterly deplorable conditions. And Freeman had the crazy idea to sort of do the assembly line lobotomy. I think his daughter once called him the Henry Ford of lobotomy, and he thought that was great. He thought that was a brilliant title. But he was responding to something really terrible. He saw real human suffering. I think he did want to make a name for himself. There's no question about it. There was he wanted the reputation and to go down in history. But there was also, he was responding to real human suffering. Whereas today, this whole transition on demand, like remove all the guardrails, give everyone the puberty blockers, the testosterone whenever they want it, they're not actually responding to real human suffering. Like these kids, these young people, I'm sure they think that they are in pain, and I'm sure the pain is real, but they are not chained to walls in mental asylums. They're not living in utterly deplorable conditions surrounded by their own filth. They just need to be left alone. They just need to be able to grow up and mature and discover themselves and who they are. And so the crime today is much worse because we just need to leave them alone. They would be absolutely fine otherwise.
Yeah, and I mean, those are great points. And it does get into that there is, though, it's like a perfect storm that we talk about. There is this cohort of folks with gender distress that are really distressed, but it is met with this sort of consumer medicine, and that this has infiltrated so deeply into, just general medicine and clinics across our country and across the world, that it's met with, a distressed cohort, a solution, a medication solution and surgeries. And it's also the other parallel, it's really scaled up into, elite circles as well, as people may or may not know that, Rosemary Kennedy from the Kennedy family had a lobotomy because her father or her family, there's different stories, but thought that, either she was, promiscuous, hypersexual, just various different things. And a lobotomy, that captured their orbit as a solution, but she basically became, a vegetable and lived out her life that way and needing long-term care. But yes, it was like there is a big cohort now of distressed, people. And when they come to the doctor's office, the doctors are like, okay, what do I do here? And the pressure has been mounted on them that, this is the solution without, taking a step back, or without being able to say, wait, no, this doesn't make sense. There are a lot of harms here. We don't have the diagnosis exactly right, etc. So
I often think it's funny what you're saying there, Carrie, because it reminds me of a thought I had earlier on today. And I see somebody was saying and I think it's a good point, there's no money in leaving them alone. There's no building professional reputation in leaving them alone. And I agree with it. It's a good point. However, I actually think there's another aspect that myself as a psychotherapist, yourself, Carrie, as a doctor, there's this kind of hunger to have resolution, to have something work in your work, if you follow me, to kind of have something that might actually be a pathway to a better life for your patients. And I think the enthusiasm can kind of, it's misplaced. We should be careful and cautious, but I think it's actually a huge part of why a lot of zealous practitioners become so zealous. They become so excited by the idea of, I'm finally offering some resolution to extraordinary mental pain. And sometimes when you're working with patients and they're utterly devastated and you want to make their life better, and you can see that there's very little there to make their life better, that I can see how somebody could fall on a solution and think, finally I have something. And it reminds me, I know I've said it before, but it's worth saying again. I remember I was giving a webinar to college counselors who were talking about gender. I've probably told you this before, but it is worth saying. And they said to me, usually when a gender student comes in, I think finally I have a solution, because when somebody comes in with anxiety or depression or panic, I feel a little bit overwhelmed. I know that the resolution really is going to be a little bit small and one step forward, two steps back, and maybe medication will work, but maybe it won't, and strategies. However, with gender, I actually had something to give them. And now you're taking that away. And I was like, yeah. Definitely. And that's where I think I'm making a very long-winded way of saying the pain of being human is almost being fought against. And some people have really difficult cards mentally. Some people are facing really difficult mental challenges. And they end up in the doctor's office, they end up in ER, they end up at psychotherapy saying, have you got anything for me? And I think we feel, as practitioners, feel deflated and overexcited when we might have a solution.
Yeah, that taking that to endocrinology, I think there's an element of that in endocrinology as well, in that Dr. Daniel Metzger, who was one of the stars of the WPATH Files report, he's a Canadian endocrinologist who has been transitioning kids for decades out in BC. And so he's the one in the WPATH Files who's saying, talking to 14-year-olds about fertility preservation is like talking to a blank wall. But then I was looking into, because he's very active, he speaks to the mainstream media about gender medicine all the time. They turn to him, and he did a podcast with CBC in February. And a question was, why do you love your job, or something like that? And he said, it's really rewarding to treat trans kids, because if a kid, it's like a kid will come in with diabetes and you've got to tell them that they're sick and they're going to be sick for the rest of their life and they're going to need treatment. Whereas a trans kid comes in and you are not delivering bad news. You are helping them become who they really are. And it's a really inspiring thing to be a part of. And I think it's precisely that these doctors, they love to treat the young gender confused kids, because they really get to feel as though they're making a difference. They're not treating an illness somehow. They're creating, new people. They're giving people a new life.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I think also just the way our healthcare system has evolved is that, people wait a long time. Things are very expensive. In the United States, people are, insurance is very complicated. And I think to your both your points, when people come to the ER and they've got something that I can't clearly, diagnose as, like, you have appendicitis, this is what we're doing. When it's something like, well, I'm not sure, we'll make sure there isn't anything life-threatening, but I don't know exactly what's going on. It takes a lot as a physician to be able to say that to people, to know when that's the right thing to say. It's very hard because people do want an answer. They want a quick answer, and there aren't always answers. And saying, well, there's going to be a period of confusion, or there may be periods of going to other appointments to figure this out. People want quick solutions. That's how it is, whether it's just because they can download a movie in 2 seconds and they just expect some of these things to be just resolved very quickly. And I also think there's a preference towards, prescribing a pill for every problem. And I think that mentality makes it really, really challenging when you have a distressed, a person in terms of, gender dysphoria or some other mental health issue, to kind of say, hey, this is really complicated. There is not a quick solution. Really hard.
I think that's got turbocharged in recent years because effectively gender, not gender medicine, but all medicine has become very consumer. And it's very interesting that back in the day, Walter Friedman was trying to advertise his lobotomy, and he was told, it's not a trade, it's a profession. You don't advertise. And that was, they were strong on that. Do you feel, I know, Mia, you've studied it a lot. Do you feel that they had more guardrails, the doctors, the medical profession, which is, although it was huge, which is why perhaps it didn't quite explode the way arguably gender medicine has exploded? It's just a thought. You might know better.
Well, there was plenty of opposition, like you said at the beginning. There was plenty of opposition right from the start. People raising concerns at meetings and whatever. But there was a different culture back then, in that it was considered unethical to criticize a fellow doctor publicly, which is, I believe, why they say that it went officially unopposed. There was no official opposition to lobotomy. There were murmurings all over, people calling it, a brain mutilation, and people were very upset in the background, but there was no official group or medical association or anyone stood up and said, no, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing this. And so like Freeman he was a showman, and he had a gift for courting the press, and he managed to, there was an article, there was a piece published in the New England Journal of Medicine right at the beginning that gave lobotomy legitimacy and made it look real, made it look safe and effective, and then it was off. And then he courted the press, and he got all of the excitement drummed up. And the strongest parallel, I think, really is the mainstream media coverage. The way that the media really, really shaped public opinion, and the fact that the media, these, the New York Times and all of these mainstream outlets, Time Magazine, they were only getting their information from Freeman, or in later stages, other people who were pro-lobotomy. And they weren't talking to any of these many doctors who were very critical of the procedure and very very speaking out against it. They never went to those people. And if they mentioned the people that died, they just tucked it in as one of the last sentences and didn't make a big deal out of it. And it's very similar to what we have seen in certainly the last decade. It's definitely changing now, not so much in Canada, but how the coverage of gender affirming care, they would always, is glowing, life-saving, medically necessary. They would turn to WPATH as, the experts, and they would get quotes from WPATH, and they would they never put the other side of it. They never found the doctors who were questioning it. And we're still kind of there in Canada. We still have the CBC and the mainstream media churning out the garbage that is fully one-sided and biased. And, you know, if you talk about Rosemary Kennedy, like they made the decision to lobotomize her in 1941, and it wasn't that long after the one of the biggest articles ever that was written about lobotomy, the Turning the Mind Inside Out article that was published in I think it was the Saturday Evening Post. And so this article was basically just Freeman. It was almost like it was written by Freeman, but it was actually written by a New York Times writer. And in there, there's an analogy with a watchmaker. They compare lobotomies to like the intricate workings of a watchmaker who's delicately, tinkering with all the mechanisms, when it's basically they're describing sticking sharp objects into the brain and wiggling them around blindly. But because they were selling it just in a completely fantasy, like totally not even remotely realistic way, and then people sought lobotomies. And I think the Kennedys were one such family.
Wow, it's frightening, really. I've got a couple of quotes. So the new, like you say, the medical record, which is the peer-reviewed, they were worried. In 1940, they said the mutilating surgeons who performed the operation, and it was a lobotomy delusion. Meanwhile, the Washington Evening Star was calling lobotomies one of the greatest surgical innovations of this generation. And the New York Times, of course, covered itself in glory. It quoted a neurosurgeon saying it was a shining example of therapeutic courage, and also called it surgery of the soul. And I can see, which is extraordinary, because it feels so familiar to us to hear something like that. And I see one of the comments there, it almost sounds like medicine as self-expression. I do want to go back to Tish's comment about her neighbour having a leucotomy. We'll go to that. But first of all, Carrie, would you like to comment on that? Because it's extraordinary, this idea of medicine for the soul and medicine as self-expression. It feels like that's where it's going.
Yes. And again, kind of what we had been talking about, that, there's this miracle cure. And of course, who would not want that? And who would not want to have the scoop on reporting on that? I think we see that too, right? It's like the madness of crowds, or the herd is all going in one direction. And, when you've got the New York Times talking about it, it's very, very compelling to a lot of people back then. And even now we see that, and so it's the sway of the milieu that you're in is very, very important. And it's really hard to go against the grain and get that attention about the problems. And I think that it's even, certainly back then they had challenges, because we think, oh, there was a handful of newspapers and this and that. And we think we have this mass communication, but in a way, I know we all see that mass communication has got a flip side to it, because it can also disseminate bad ideas as well. And the network effect now of insurance and massive hospital systems, that didn't exist back then. One wonders if that had existed, and if it had gotten even more widespread, because it could quickly network. So a different time, but that human condition of wanting to be part of the solution, wanting to be in the pages of the New York Times, I don't think that has changed, that part of human nature.
I agree with you. And one other thing that hasn't changed, and we have to give a bit of time to that, is the treatment of women, which Tish raised in the chat, and she's dead right to raise it. So she said, a neighbour of hers received a leucotomy and was in an asylum. And, obviously in Ireland, like, so many unmarried mothers ended up in asylums. Like, even in the 1990s, there was still unmarried women who were just starting. Yeah, I know. It's because they'd been institutionalized. They would have been put in 50 years before. And it's just such an awful history. But when you look at the lobotomy scandal and you look at the numbers and you look at the fact of just there's an extraordinary response to emotional, passionate women. There always has been. And then you look at the gender issue and you look at all the numbers of girls. I know there are boys, but it feels like there's a consistent almost fear around women and their emotions and their high emotions, and and then I think of obviously the witches and you know what I mean? It just feels like there's something about the medical profession, perhaps, or maybe doctors with godlike complex, or maybe the paternalistic aspect of it. It does come across very strongly in the lobotomy scandal.
Yeah, I think it was husbands that were bringing in their wives for whatever, like minor, sometimes, I mean, some of them were, if you look at there are first-hand accounts of, my mother's lobotomy and everything. And there are really, like, truly, there were some people who felt that they had been given their mother back or whatever. I think they were in the minority for sure, but yeah, they would be taken in for the most, because it was marketed, it was sold as a cure for the symptoms that would typically be considered female complaints, just the depression or the mild anxiety. It was sold in a very unrealistic way, and I guess that just attracted more female patients. And then all of the lobotomists, I don't think there was a single female lobotomist, so it was all men performing these procedures on mostly women. I mean, now, yeah, it's again gender medicine. The younger group, the social contagion, I suppose we could call it, or the more recent group, is obviously predominantly female. And again, it's just because it's very difficult to go through puberty as a girl. It's very difficult to be a girl in this world, and it's very difficult to exist online as a girl. So the girl's getting sucked into it.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's like that pathologizing of puberty, as a problem. It's unfortunately has these echoes, like we're saying, that girls more emotional in some cases, and then fall into this sinkhole of, some quick solution for their emotions.
Yeah, but the normal struggles of existence, the normal struggles of life that you would get past if there were not this brutal, irreversible remedy being thrust upon you. I mean, Friedman, like, another parallel is when Friedman, it was supposed to be a last resort for the more serious cases, and then Friedman came to the conclusion that the more serious cases weren't responding well to the lobotomy, so that meant better to intervene in the less serious cases. And that meant more and more people with only mild mental illness, and mostly women, were being considered eligible for lobotomies, which is very similar to now. Kind of similar in that they looked at the outcome for the men, the adults in the early stages of the gender experiment, and they saw that the results were not good. So then they're like, well, we need to intervene earlier. And of course, they're then intervening with children, adolescents, who, if left alone, they would have the gender dysphoria would have resolved, and they would have found comfort in their bodies. The same thing with Friedman, like most of those mild cases that he lobotomized, they would have the mental distress would have resolved if they'd been left alone.
What's key, it feels to me, is, and many of us will know this story, I'd say, Mia, you could probably tell us it well, is Walter Freeman's determination to prove to himself that he was right, that it was the right treatment. And I'm sure we all see it, myself and Carrie see it among, other practitioners and stuff, this kind of absolute determination that I couldn't be wrong because it's so devastating that I'm wrong. I can't contemplate it. Now, I think we're going to be faced with that for some time. And I think the more we're aware that the ability for the human to say, I was wrong, I'm completely wrong, I've hurt people, I've damaged people, and it wasn't appropriate, is very limited. And so, I've heard you say it often, Mia, but like the so many of the people who had lobotomies were very pleased that they had lobotomies, but I can't help but think, but then they had lobotomies.
I think it was more the families,
Yeah.
though. I mean, some people were happy. Yeah, I think some people were happy with their own lobotomy, but it was mostly the families. And that ties in with the whole Freeman thing. So it's if you have made a decision that is irreversible and came at great cost, then you are going to be very psychologically motivated to convince yourself that that was the right decision, to turn a blind eye, to blind yourself to the harm of it, and stay on the track that, yes, when you made the decision to lobotomize your loved one, you are definitely going to try and look at only the positives and ignore all the negatives and try and convince yourself that that was the right decision. But Freeman, I mean, the fact that that man went to his grave still convinced that the transorbital lobotomy was a gift to humanity, shows just how powerful the blindness, the willful blindness can be, in that he didn't just avoid the victims. He actually he spent the last years of his life while dying of cancer. He had metastatic cancer, and he spent the last years of his life driving around the US, following up all of the patients, as many as he could find that he had lobotomized, not out of concern for their health and well-being, out of concern for his reputation. He was searching for evidence that his transorbital lobotomy had helped all of these patients. And he was convinced that if he could just gather enough evidence, he could convince the medical world to bring it back, even after it was at that point, it was utterly reviled. And they had, the antipsychotic drugs, and they had other options, and lobotomy was totally gone. And so Megan McArdle, all three of us, I know we're all big fans of Megan McArdle. I have to bring it up. She wrote this gorgeous article last year in the Washington Post, where she calls it the Oedipus trap, based on the Greek myth, where Oedipus, he kills his father, marries his mother, and then when he finds out what he's done, he gouges out his own eyes because some mistake.
She hangs herself.
That's it. She hanged herself, and then didn't he take pins from her dress and gouged out his own eyes? Because some mistakes are so terrible that you cannot look at them. Better to gouge out your own eyes. I think right now, with many of these gender doctors, it really would be better to gouge out their own eyes than to look upon all the ruined lives, all of the kids that they have sterilized unnecessarily, all of the healthy breasts that they have removed for absolutely no reason whatsoever, all of the genital surgeries that have left these men and women in a permanent state of disability for nothing, because none of it was necessary. There was always the option. I mean, maybe for some there is no other option, and maybe I always make these really strong statements that nobody benefits, and then trans activists get really upset. So I'm willing to concede the fact that, yeah, maybe some people are in such a state of distress that they are helped by their genital surgery. But I can't imagine that any woman is in so much distress that her mental health and physical health is helped by having an appendage made out of her forearm sewn onto her groin. I simply cannot believe that. But, you know, people tell me that some people are helped. However, I just think all of these doctors, they made that decision to go gender affirming care, and they promoted it, and they sent all of these innocent, healthy people down this brutal medical path. And at this point, when the evidence is so strong and mounting, and the victims are becoming more and more visible every day, I think many of them are now Walter Friedman. They are in the last years of his life, you know, like they are in that stage where the victims are there, but they cannot look upon them. They can't let themselves see the harm.
It reminds me, and I want to bring you in, Carrie, now in a second, but it reminds me of that Richard Feynman quote, you know, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And I'm glad you have the humility, Mia, to say we could be wrong. It feels outlandish when you said about the forearm and the appendage and sewn it to your groin. It feels to me like, well, that's insane. But I am willing to be open to the possibility. Well, the first person to, like, of course, I'm invested in my theories, and so long as everybody else could have the humility to be aware that they could be wrong, the better.
Right. I mean, I don't want to concede too much. I am willing to accept that perhaps, yes, some people are helped. However, I still remain convinced, certainly with phalloplasty, even with the genital surgeries in general, and with mastectomies, to be honest, I think I am convinced far more people are harmed than helped. And if that's the case, then there's no medical justification for doing this, because the same thing with lobotomy. Maybe some people were helped. So some people certainly did say that they were better after their lobotomy. Many families were happy too. But that doesn't mean we should still be doing lobotomies. If more people are harmed than helped, we shouldn't do it. It's ethically wrong.
What do you think, Carrie?
Yeah. And also, I mean, there's, you know, alternatives, treatments. But even before that, there's a whole issue with just what is it that's being treated? You know, that is constantly kind of a shifting thing. And so in today's day and age, I mean, I would be, you know, I'm stronger about it, Mia, in the sense that there isn't a clear understanding of what exactly they're treating. What are the endpoints? You know, how do you diagnose what you're treating? How do you evaluate whether someone's getting better or not? If you're not doing follow-up, and if you're experimenting with dosages that really relate to cosmetic looks, that's very different. It's really expanded into a totally different area. But I think, you know, to your point about practitioners who are very zealous about this, you know, I think the degree to which they're closing their eyes to just constructive discussion and debate and looking at the literature, and the viciousness of trying to go after people who have a different point of view. I mean, just in healthcare is just so grossly unprofessional and outside the box of how anybody behaves in healthcare. You're always concerned about doing the best for the patient. It's a culture of safety, raising concern issues. So it just has really gone so extreme where maybe they're covering their eyes, but they're also trying to be they're very brutal to people who think differently. And that's just gone to a place that is just completely unacceptable and very much a red flag in terms of, you know, what are you, you know, you can't look at, you're so ashamed of what potentially is going on, but you're trying to pull everyone in to this shame. And the brutality is just, it's such a high level. So I think it's something that is a big part of this scandal and is going to be very difficult to unpack, because as I've talked about before, this is so deep into medical practice, into healthcare systems, into medical groups. And then with the recent, recent changes with Title IX and some of the other healthcare regulations, Obamacare 1557, where it's being written as a civil right. So if it became a civil right to have a lobotomy, it would be a whole different way of approaching it that isn't just talking about the merits of the medical evidence. So I think we're just into uncharted territory in terms of this compared to what they were dealing with lobotomies. Yeah.
You're right, but there is a noticeable similarity insofar as lack of follow-up and lack of control groups.
Yeah.
They seem two resoundingly familiar issues. I saw it today. Now, I'm not an expert, but I did read it a couple of places that Igaz Moniz, the original guy, the Nobel Prize winner for the lobotomy, his longest follow-up was 11 days. And it's like, what the hell is that? What the hell is that?
For the original 20 cases, when he, 7 successes, 7 unchanged. Right.
I should laugh because people's lives were destroyed, and they still are destroyed with this lack of follow-up. It feels to me, and I'd be very interested what you two think, it just feels to me that it should be essential when people are carrying out experimental interventions that there's not only a control group, but a procedural follow-up that just doesn't get messed around with. That this should be an essential aspect of medicine.
It normally is, but this is captured this aspect of a social contagion, cultural phenomenon, pipeline through schools. And I think that, all the people coming to these clinics, and then there was this quick solution in this infrastructure, all of that has gotten so ahead of everything, because at least, in our country, there is an NIH study going on through children's hospitals. They've released, it's something in the New England Journal, but it's like, if you were going to even say it was okay to do, you would do the study, but they're doing the study, but there's just thousands of kids that have already been exposed, thousands of vulnerable adults without, clear understanding of the doses they're getting, the adverse effects from other medications that they're on, and the loss to follow-up. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, and the Cass report, clearly pointed that out as well. That the data isn't being collected or it's not being shared, which is also just very concerning. And so it's really not within the normal ethical bounds of how we practice medicine. And I know we, again, saw that with what they were doing with lobotomies. It wasn't systematic tracking.
Yeah, some of the language I find when you read about lobotomies, you'll hear them. They're saying, "Oh yeah, so future research with follow-up will show us whether this is actually, effective and safe." And that's so like reading WPATH Standards of Care 7 and 8. It's all about, future research may reveal whether this approach to gender medicine is safe and effective. It's like, you've been doing it for decades. You still don't have any of the research. No one's doing the research. And yet they still keep saying, but remember, they refuse to use the word experimental, because if they say experimental, there'll be no insurance coverage. But it's almost like, with lobotomies, there's the runaway diffusion. I loved that concept in The Myth of Reliable Research, the paper where they were explaining that puberty blockers was it was an innovative experiment that they were just testing out a hypothesis basically, and they just they had somewhat positive results, but it was a small sample size and very methodologically flawed. And then for some reason, the medical world took that one experiment, and instead of doing the controlled trials and carefully measuring whether it really was a positive treatment, they just unleashed it into mainstream medicine right at the very moment in 2014, 2015, that the social contagion began, and all of the gender clinics got flooded with these adolescent girls. But the same thing really with lobotomy. They had this crazy idea. They had, you know, deeply flawed research to suggest that the treatment was positive. They did no control trials. They did nothing, no follow-up, nothing to say, yes, this is safe and effective. Let's roll it out into mainstream practice. Nothing. They just, again, runaway diffusion. They just unleashed it upon the field of psychiatry, and all hell broke loose. But it's almost, that's in the days before evidence-based medicine. It's decades ago. It's still an inexcusable crime, but it was decades ago, in the days before we had systems in place to prevent something like lobotomies happening again. And yet still the field of gender medicine has managed to commit another such crime.
And arguably will again and again, because it's the combination of the human's need to look for a solution and a discomfort around ambiguity, coupled with kind of the capitalist kind of feeling of, come on then, give me the solution and I'll pay for it. It feels like it's going to be inevitable something. I think ethics actually in medicine is going to be the big issue over the next century. It's getting more and more complex, and it's really stretching brains. Will we look at some of the questions and answers, the Q&A, because I think there's some really good questions there. I've noticed.
Yeah, we've got Q&A and we've got the chat too, which is amazing. Yeah, very, very lively.
I just want to say one thing about the chat, Carrie, because it's close to your heart, and we should arguably, you know, we all want to do the multiple personality scandal at some stage, so hopefully that'll get onto the menu. And also the opioid, you know, the opioid crisis.
Yes.
You know, there's a lot of lessons to learn kind of in kind of recent history as such.
Yes. I mean, that's the parallel, I think, with, you know, again, the people are suffering. You don't want them to suffer. Our job, you know, as physicians is to heal. But again, I think in this consumer age and pharmaceutical age, and now we've got, you know, the avatars and social media and whatnot of the perfect lives and the perfect solution, you get the people showing up, you know, wanting the quick solution. And with the opioid epidemic, a lot of doctors, you know, just thought, well, I'm helping their pain, I'm making their life better, but they were detached from the sequelae. And then when they saw the sequelae, they had a really hard time saying no, because there was so much pressure to be pleasing to, you know, how can you go against, you know, how can you say no to someone who's suffering? But, you know, if they're addicted or they're diverting meds or their life has gotten so messy because they're not functional because of the medicines, you're not helping them anymore. But it was really hard for most doctors, just kind of wrote the scripts and looked the other way.
But it's one thing we must, over the coming weeks and months, we must look at how they were brought down. Like, you know, somebody in the comments, and I really agree with them, say, you know, that Ken Kesey, you know, first of all, the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and the ECT, and then the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it was pivotal in changing the culture. One strong film with the charismatic character, both one way and the other way, can be such an extraordinary impact that it's kind of it's hard to underestimate if it's done well. One question I think is interesting is I can see a question that still has relevance, and all of you pick out the questions that you find interesting, but I like this one. A question that still has relevance: who paid for lobotomies? Was it the insurers, the government, the patients' families? I don't know that.
You know, I don't know either. I know, you see, they were the cost-effective solution for the mental asylums were in absolute, you know, they were overloaded. They could not cope with the number of patients that they had. And so the mental asylums saw lobotomy as the solution to their financial troubles. Certainly the transorbital took about 5 minutes, and somebody has asked who was performing the transorbital who perform lobotomies. In the beginning, it was neurosurgeons, but then with the transorbital, it was psychiatrists. It was Friedman bragged about the fact that he could teach anyone to perform the procedure. So I think they were. I don't know how much they really cost. I mean, they saved the asylums money.
At one point, he was doing two at the one time in some sort of weird circus trick.
And there's a horrible story of like he would jab both ice picks in at the same time and then take a photograph. And there's a story of how one woman died
True story.
on the table while he was taking a photograph. He basically died because, she died because he wanted a photograph. And then he just, packed up his bag and left and went off to the next asylum where he was going to perform more. So I said at the beginning, I was expecting a monster. In many ways, this man was a monster, but that's his inability to see the victims. He blinds himself to the harm.
Yeah.
It's
And as Carrie said earlier, and you can come in now, Carrie, but you said not only were they blind to the victims and the harm, but these days they're insisting everybody else remains blind.
Yeah.
That feels like insult upon injury.
Yes, which is so challenging, about this whole topic and why we do our work, here at Genspect and other groups to try and really show moral courage and, attach to reality, that this is not right. But in terms of the payment, I think, a lot of it had to have been out of pocket, because I don't know how there was public funding for the institutions. But the health insurance at a mass scale, it started in the 30s, but it really didn't get going till after the post-war, because it got in the United States got tied to people's jobs after that. And then, then Medicare and Medicaid didn't start here until like the mid 1960s. So it's an interesting question, which we could research, but I think the large scale payment systems weren't even in existence, back then.
I see an interesting question here that I think is a good point that merits discussion, which is I read a paper talking about the grip that the satanic abuse scandal had on the psychology profession and why this was not covered in any training. It was just memory hold out of embarrassment. How can we improve reflection and training so practitioners are aware of their fallibility? So I'm in kind of certainly adjacent to the psychology profession as a psychotherapist. And I really do think that Abigail Schreier nails it in her recent book. Psychotherapists and psychologists and psychiatrists, we don't tend to admit that we get it wrong. We tend to be very clever and talk about different things, and we can rationalize anything. But our ability to say, "No, we've got that wrong," is really limited. We're a limited profession that likes to kind of talk on high. We're very flawed. We really, I shouldn't laugh. I'm so devastated that I've ended up in this profession because it's gone so badly awry. I'm kind of like gallows humor about it at this stage.
I love the part when she basically says the therapist is the product. And so, if a doctor prescribes a drug and it's not working, well, we'll stop that drug and we'll give you a different one. We'll try something else. Whereas if the therapy is not working, that's it. The therapy is the product and there's nothing else you can try. So there's this reluctance to admit that perhaps the therapy is not working. But the satanic panic, this is why this is why I never stop going on about past medical scandals. It's why I put the case studies in the report, and my next report will have a case study in it too. I think the answer is surely with your training, whichever profession you're in, medical training, psychiatric training, it should contain, like, there should be a focus on all of the past blunders that your profession has made, or medicine in general, just to remind you of how, you know, doctors are human too, and they get swept up in crazy moments, and they let their ambition run away with them, and they forget the Hippocratic Oath. Just training, just learn history. We can learn so much from it.
I'd like to ask Carrie on this one, because I've often thought, like, you know, in fairness, we could learn a lot from the aviation industry. They have the black box, and when there is an accident, they study the black box to the nth degree to see what went wrong. While in psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, and in, as far as I can see, in medicine, there's not this black box attitude. It's like that's down to human error and we'll move on. It doesn't do to kind of second guess our errors. And arguably, like Mia's just said, we should actually bring in the black box aviation industry to it and look at our errors in depth, because there have been too many of them and they are currently ongoing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you make that parallel, because actually, you know, in the past 20, 25 years, the aviation industry has been a role model for at least the safety movement in, you know, I'm hospital based, you know, a safety movement in the hospital, with inside hospitals, and especially in emergency medicine. And so that's why all this is so outside the norm, because there's safety meetings every day. There's a computerized system to enter even the smallest safety issue, like a medication mistake. You're trained, and it's incumbent upon you, and also just part of your contract working in the hospital, that you're supposed to be reporting these things. And there are all types of guardrails around it. And that's where, when we've talked, you know, in the past about the electronic health record, I put in safety alerts in our hospital system when I see something unsafe. So that, you know, because there was a big report about 25 years ago that in the Institute of Medicine that one of the biggest causes of death were, you know, errors, medical related iatrogenic errors, meaning errors, you know, that are caused by the system. And so things really had been moving in that direction. So some of these things we see with gender medicine and how they're bending the rules and removing the guardrails is really not at all what has been going on or goes on in other aspects of medicine. So that's a huge red flag. And then just to quickly piggyback on Mia's point about history, I mean, that's why we're doing this. I mean, that's why we're really committed to doing webinars and getting the CME, because I feel very strongly that one of the things I can do as a physician is make sure that I'm transmitting the information and the history and memorializing it down, you know, to other people, the generation below me, because that is my responsibility to do that. That's
just
part of
say that,
teaching. Yeah.
almost inadvertently, as we launch our CME kind of series and scheme, you know, Mia came up with, well, we should, you know, it should be part of training to look at blunders. And here we are, day one.
Right. That's exactly right. But, you know, when I went through medical school, the blunders, I mean, you have peer review. I was going to say, if there's a specific case that goes wrong, that is very serious. In anything, my practice, years of practice, and in the hospital, it is picked apart. And obviously, if there's malpractice, that's in the lawsuit world. But there's peer review where, when there's, you know, a death, even if it was, you know, a natural cause, they look at everything. So the systems are in there. Part of what this scandal is about is, why are people ignoring the systems? And, you know, there's lots of people that have written about, Malcolm Gladwell's written about different people, why people ignore systems and end up, you know, the pilot crashes into a mountain because he wasn't listening to, like, his co-pilot. And we're in that territory where it's raising awareness, building the guardrails because the safety systems have been crashed through and people are getting hurt.
Could I go back to one of the questions? I think it's an interesting one. How does lobotomy compare to gender medicine in terms of the willingness of patients to undergo the treatment?
I'd say that's one of the biggest differences, actually, is there certainly were people. Well, no, there definitely, when the New York Times and Time magazine, they were in full swing promoting this miracle cure. There definitely were people who fixated on it and desperately wanted a lobotomy. More often, it was family members who were struggling or had a loved one that they felt should be lobotomized, and they would seek the procedure. So I would say that's one of the biggest differences. There wasn't the cult-like mentality. There wasn't the total mass psychosis, I suppose, that we're living through now, where these kids are, they've got swept up in something. They're not completely tethered to reality. They've got swept up in something that is giving that they've just come to the wrong conclusion, and they are obviously absolutely convinced that the gender medicine, the hormones and the surgeries are going to fix all of their problems. And so I would not say people were desperately seeking lobotomies in the same way that these young people. There wasn't the social contagion element, you see. There wasn't we had the mainstream media element, but we did not have the political movement, and we did not have this psychiatric epidemic that makes this one. Again, that's why gender affirming care is worse than lobotomies, because we have, just as I was saying, like when the field of gender medicine totally lost its mind was around 2014, 2015, when it went full on affirmation, remove all the guardrails, give this untested experimental treatment to every kid who walks through the door. They lost their minds completely at the exact same moment that the social contagion began. And the social contagion began because the modern trans rights movement really ramped up the messaging at the same time. All of these things are connected, of course, because the modern trans rights movement is also what caused the field of gender medicine to totally lose its ethical compass. It was the pressure and the political activists who had overrun WPATH and put all the pressure on to remove all the guardrails. So we use the perfect storm. We use it rather a lot, but it really truly was a perfect storm. And again, that's why this scandal, I think, is so much worse than lobotomies.
But there is a point that the parents of gender nonconforming kids, some of them very much are pushing blockers, and you could argue their distressed kid, sort my kid out. So there is a bit of that happening.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, so you've got the social contagion kids, and then you've got the children, the completely innocent Jazz Jennings type children. They're not part of the social contagion. It's the parents who are completely controlling, calling the shots on that one. And yes, then they are seeking. I think the parents, to be as generous as I can, they are also swept up in this mad cultural moment. They are also in some way victims of the modern trans rights movement and the fictional world that it created. Those parents exist in that culture as well. And I really do think that every parent is trying to make the best decision for their child. It's hard when you look at Jazz Jennings, it's hard to look at that type of family and think that the mother thought she was doing the right thing, think that the father thought he was doing the right thing. But I really do think that they made a decision to ease their child's pain in the moment. The child was suffering and was, wanted to fit in, and they didn't fit in. So they socially transitioned the kid, thinking that if it weren't right for the child, then the child would detransition. The child would tell them, listen to the child, let the child lead, because they didn't understand the power of social transition. They didn't understand that the moment that they made that decision, they locked their child into a pathway that was ultimately going to end with the hormones and the surgeries.
And I saw somebody, I think it was Sasha was saying to me, you know, so some people are normophilic, as in they want their kids to be normal as such. And so when their kids are kind of non-conforming in some way, their determination to kind of normalize them. I know that isn't some parents, but you know, when you look at the Jazz Jennings story, there's a question I think you could answer, Carrie, because it feels like it's very reflective. Gender is almost the canary in the coal mine. Like when you see this question, aren't some of the psychiatric drugs like quetiapine being overprescribed and doing terrible damage? It feels like that's the issue, the overprescription and overdiagnosis in our culture.
Yeah, and I just think it's the same pattern, right? It's those meds were created. I mean, it's, lobotomies really fell out of favor, because the phenothiazines and the antipsychotics basically were discovered in the 1950s. And then that was like, oh my gosh, there's a pill and this is a promise. And again, we can say that definitely helped people with these, what they would call, very negative symptoms and with psychosis that were otherwise going to be chained to the wall. And so that was huge promise. And then, of course, the pharmaceutical industry is, creating more and more a new generation. And we can see again how, the DSM was created and lists up to, categorize your symptoms. And then that, has gotten out of control. But there is a complete overprescribing that I see, for things that, someone who is really psychotic would be on these meds. And then I'd say 15 years ago, I started seeing people who weren't psychotic on the meds. And then I started seeing kids on the meds, where you'll see, a 10-year-old on this stuff. So it's that same pattern, that some distress is attached to a diagnosis, which is attached to a pill. And that's a pattern that I see, and we've talked, a bit about the different tentacles and why and stuff. But yeah, there's overprescribing, and I also, we don't think enough about how all the medicines mix together and could be contributing to increasing psychosis, increasing dysphoria, increasing delusions, that could be making, the gender dysphoria worse. And so I think that's something that really is important, I talk about, but really is understudied.
And also the numbing, arguably, of the libido, especially kids who are supposed to be having a sexual awakening, but SSRIs are tampering with that. Yeah. I remember, like I'm not 20 years working as a psychotherapist, but in my lifetime in working as a psychotherapist, there's been a phenomenal change of the amount of teenagers who I never would have seen them. They were not on SSRIs when I was first working. They just weren't. And now it's so common. And very often, I'm sad to say, very often it's something like exam stress or, a traumatic kind of breakup with a boyfriend, really something that you would not have considered prescribed medication. And these are teenagers who are still growing. And it's so much more common than people realize.
It is. And I see, it's same with like the amphetamines, it's like, oh, well, for, to focus for an exam. Well, that's not like how they came out in the market, it's for people with ADHD. And so I think this level of drug of abuse, is really important, again, to talk about and factors in and kind of, again, fits that pattern with lobotomies, like people suffering, we have a solution, but it just gets scaled up and it's way too broad, and it's causing harms.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah. The thing you said there about the market, though, it was such a good point, because I was reading about it earlier, just looking for it here, that they frowned upon Walter Friedman and Freeman trying to kind of advertise his wares, because they were saying this is not a trade, this is a profession. And I think we really need to kind of revisit that entire concept of the profession of being a doctor brings with it a lot of responsibilities. And this isn't, you're not selling your wares the way that there was it's kind of a beautiful but sad analogy. Somebody in the chat said, they said a post-surgical trans patient is a person who embarks on a solo voyage sailing around the world without end. There's no help, follow-up, or support. It's like it's a kind of, they're leaving Earth. It's like, off you go. May it go well, because for some it does. For some, they just don't get the medical complications that others get absolutely walloped, and we don't know why. Why is it one person who gets absolutely walloped and somebody else doesn't? It feels like it's incredibly similar to the lobotomy. Some people came back saying, honestly, the swishing around with the ice pick seemed to do something, while somebody else, it's like, it absolutely, like Rosemary Kennedy, it devastated her.
Well, it wasn't exactly a precise procedure. They had no clue. They were just jabbing them in blindly. So I guess it was just luck, what they severed, what they didn't. With the outcome of gender surgeries or transition in general, again, it's very difficult to know. Even the people who say that they're happy, because of that powerful, like the power of irrevocability, like when you've made that decision and there's no going back, you have to be right. You have to have made the right decision. If you've sacrificed your genitals, or if you've sacrificed your breasts or your fertility, you have to be right. So even these people who, they may not have the complications and they're saying that they're happy, it's still, to me, I'm not entirely sure how much we can trust that. I really don't think self-report is a reliable measure of whether or not we should be performing these procedures.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you can talk to that self-report, Carrie. Go ahead.
Oh, I
Jeff.
just was going to quickly, because I know we've run over, although we started late, but in today's day and age, with the computerization and the network effect and all the money invested in electronic health records, and now pharmacies there's electronic bridges and all types of data entry and reporting systems. It's just, again, unconscionable that there is not long-term data. There's not, the willingness to share the data, to have that all collected. We could know a lot about the adverse effects, the tracking that's needed to be done, et cetera. In the WPATH files, there's concerns for, cancer risk. I mean, all of these things are coming down the pipeline, and it's just unethical and unconscionable not to be treating all these patients with the high ethics and practice that is possible. It's just that the toxicity, the ideology of the debate, and the shunning of people who want to talk and raise concerns is just taking this to a place that's just outside the regular practice of medicine.
Yeah,
So,
and we're coming towards the end, and it's such a good point you're raising, Carrie, because it feels to me that if you were to like parallel the lobotomy delusion with the trans phenomenon, you could arguably say, there's huge similarities, huge similarities, and an awful lot of, frankly, damage done to an awful lot of people. But the medical profession didn't quite lose their head as much with the lobotomies as they have lost it here. And it feels like the consumer aspect, the consumerism that has crept in. So back in the day of Walter Friedman, when they almost advertised it, they were told off, and they were told, you lose your license if you advertise, because you're not allowed to advertise. You have a profession. We've lost that. Now we're advertising everything. It's all become a consumer product. And it feels, is that right, Mia and Carrie? Do you think that is the big difference, or there's probably plenty of other differences?
I think one of the biggest differences to me is it's a human rights crusade.
Oh yeah.
Which it wasn't really with lobotomy. I mean, they did think that they were helping. They were trying to deal with a very terrible situation in asylums. But this is a human rights crusade. These gender affirming doctors are seized with the justice of their cause, and they also, as well, I think an element of it is because they have viciously attacked anyone who disagreed. They have vilified and they have viciously attacked. That makes it even harder for them to face up, to confront their error. It makes it even harder for them to face up to the mistake that they've made, because not only have they done terrible harm to all the patients, but they've also ruined lives and bullied people and viciously attacked those who were actually right. And so it's an even greater incentive not to look, just to carry on looking the other way, and just, I don't even know at this point. I don't know what is going on in their mind. They must know that the end is near. What's going on right now? I think about that often, and I don't know how they're doing it.
And I think of Walter Friedman and think he thought he was on a human rights crusade. He was traveling through those psychiatric hospitals like a man possessed, thinking he was saving them all, completely blinding himself to the fact that he wasn't, but he really was. And there's one last question I'd like you to talk to, Carrie, but we'll have to close up soon.
Sure.
So many pregnant women are now on SSRIs, says one person, and other psychoactive drugs. What kind of damage are we doing to all these unborn children? I'm an obstetrician, and I would conservatively estimate that 40% of my patients are on these drugs.
Wow.
I mean, it again kind of fits the pattern we've been talking about. I mean, I think in the attempt, and then again, Abigail gets into this in her book, but in the attempt to, address distress and certainly postpartum depression or depression during pregnancy, I think there's just been wider screening, more people caught in it, but again, very difficult, more women, they're on meds. And again, a lot of this is not studied in a systematic way. I mean, it used to be, again, when I started out practice, it was like, you not on anything if you're pregnant. And then this stuff kind of creeped in. I'm not an expert on the all the studies, but I do know that these things aren't well done in terms of follow-up on effect on children. So, but I think it's just part of this polypharmacy that is just gone too far. I mean, we just see it in so many areas. And, I think the consumerization just a little bit with, I think part of the human rights story, there's definitely that, people think this is, a new part of, being gay. We know that's not true, but there is an element of this that because of the mass consumerization in healthcare and the way at least the system is in the US, that things have gotten so expensive. And so to actually have your preferences paid for, they have masterfully made it a civil right and got it written into the laws, which bypasses the conversation about medical necessity and evidence. So if it's a civil right, you're not allowed to, discriminate. And so that's getting your services covered because it requires your medical identity requires prescriptions and potentially surgeries. So that means you have to have an interaction with the healthcare system, and it's expensive. So I think that's part of it.
It's funny, the fear of kind of insanity or discomfort around insanity certainly drove a lot of the lobotomies, but the fear of sadness used to be driving a lot of transition, just ordinary human angst that we're all prone to. Yeah.
I mean, I see that again in my work, just with people, alcoholism and all kinds of things. I tell people, it's hard to be an adult. No one really tells you that. No one says this is hard. I mean, I know we're, like pre-internet era, there wasn't all these avatars out there of like supposedly the grass is greener on the other side and all that. But, the message that life is hard and you have to work hard to be joyful. It's hard work. It just doesn't pop up, and it's not found in a pill or a bottle or anything like that. That's a countercultural message, in healthcare, where it's kind of like, hey, the quick fix, and here's, the next thing. Plus, we have advertising of pharmaceuticals in our country. Just us in New Zealand are the only ones that advertise on TV. So the message is out there about, there's a solution for everything in big pharma. Not to say that they don't do wonderful things, but that line has gotten crossed. I think we all agree that and the gender ideology expansion is part of that, taking it way too far.
Well, we're going to close up. Any last thoughts you'd like to say? I can see that we've just about 900 people tuned in on Twitter. Thank you very much. And about 100 odd.
Wow.
Yeah, on the YouTube, and then obviously here. It's been lively. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Have you any last thoughts, maybe Mia, as well as Carrie, on, what we could learn from the lobotomy that might help us in the gender? Anything at all that we could take away from it?
Goodness me. I think it's obvious. I mean, we should have learned it, that you can have an idea and it may seem like a great idea, but unless you have tested it, unless there is proof that it is safe and beneficial and effective, don't send it widespread into the mainstream medicine. Caution, it really is very, very simple that we have made catastrophic mistakes. Lobotomy was a terrible, terrible error, and it was born out of a mixture of unbridled ambition and enthusiasm in the press and desperation from patients and families. All of these things still exist in the field of gender medicine and in the medical world today. But just be cautious. In the absence of good quality evidence, don't just leap in and let it go widespread.
Yeah, it reminds me of that quote from Richard Feynman, another quote from Richard Feynman. It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's wrong. You know what I mean? That, like, forget about your lovely idea of we can do this and we can do that. You can feel the madness of the clinicians creating their crazy theories. And it's like, yeah, it's not working out. A bit of humility. Carrie, would you like to finish us off? Thanks very much.
Yeah, I would just say, every human system needs checks and balances. We know, like, our country, how it was founded, with systems of checks and balances, and doctors and nurses and everybody writing prescriptions are humans, which means we're subject to human foibles. And hubris and blind spots and pride and all of those things. So the medical system has to have checks and balances. And like I said, it had worked very hard to be like the airline industry, safety things, checks and balances. And this is outside of checks and balances and the shaming of debate. And so we debate, we discuss. That's part of the joy of practicing medicine. So this is not that, and they're huge red flags. So I think that that history will repeat itself when you are in an environment that doesn't have proper checks and balances, resistance, and the ability to raise your concerns and debate. So that's one of the take homes.
So thank you all very much for the very lively chat. We'll definitely keep that open from now on. And the questions, It was really good. This time it's farce. Last time it was tragedy. It's tragedy as well. I think we're not going to be here next week. But we're here the week after, and we've quite a few. Do you want to say a couple of the things we have lined up, Carrie? And don't forget, we've got our CME now, the accreditation.
Yeah. So go over to the Genspect Substack for the clinicians that need continuing medical education. And then we're basically, going through Mia's unbelievable, case reports in the WPATH files. So like Stella said, we won't be here next week, but the week after with ovarotomies or oophorectomies. So basically removing women's ovaries. So that kind of gets into some of the things we talked about, but, other issues. And then after that, I believe it's, the impulse to, cut off your healthy body parts, which has a difficult name that I can't even pronounce. Yeah.
I pronounce it apotemnophilia, but I don't know if that's right. That's the way it looks to me.
Yes. And then
I just say the amputation.
I say the amputation. Then after that is the discussion around engineering, children's heights, because that started, very, specifically, which Mia gets into, and sort of the tragedy around that. But we do still see patients are on, synthetic hormones for that. So I think it gets into an interesting conversation about the past and the present, and then we'll see where it takes it from there. Yeah, but
I'm very interested in adding multiple personality disorder, and also ECT to discuss that. That would be very interesting, and also, of course, the opioid scandal. So there's a lot more, and we'd be very interested in other people's ideas, because I think it's a huge subject. But until the next time, thank you all very much. It's been really, really interesting. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.